Hello, everyone, and welcome to the last SSP webinar of the year. This Scholarly Kitchen SSP webinar is the future of research funding. I'm Jeff Lang with the American Chemical Society, the chair of the SSP Webinars Working Group, and I'm pleased that you could join us today. In a moment, we'll get started and we'll hear from our moderator and panelists. Your phone will be muted automatically in consideration of our presenters and your fellow webinar participants. Please use the questions feature to send your questions in, or if you need to let us know that you're having technical difficulties. The moderator will review your questions and present them to the panelists. To help him, please specify to which presenter you'd like your question directed. Also, please send in your questions as we go instead of waiting till the end. At the conclusion of today's presentation, you'll receive a webinar evaluation via email. We encourage you to provide feedback so you can continually improve the SSP webinar program. You'll also receive a link via email to the recorded broadcast of this webinar. Our moderator today is Todd Carpenter. Todd joined NISO as Executive Director in September of 2006. In this role, he provides leadership at NISO as well as focuses on improving constituent relationships, standards development, and operational procedures. Prior to joining NISO, he worked in a variety of marketing management roles at the Hawthorne Press, the Energy Intelligence Group, Johns Hopkins University Press, and BioOne. Todd is also a Scholarly Kitchen chef and former SSP board member. Here's Todd, who will introduce the panel and get us started.
All right, good morning, everyone, and welcome. We have a fantastic program today. We are going to be looking at the future of research funding, and we've asked a variety of people to join us today who have a variety of roles in funding organizations that support the scholarly community. Joining us today, first in alphabetical order, is Stuart Buck. Stuart is Vice President of Research at Arnold Ventures. I want to say hello, Stuart. Lyric Jorgensen is Deputy Director at the Office of Science Policy at the National Institutes of Health. Steve Pinchotti is Chief Executive Officer at Altum. And Lloyd Whitman is Assistant to the Director of Science Policy and Planning at the National Science Foundation.
Thanks, great to be here.
So, looking at our community in scholarly communication, there are many government, corporate, and institutional funding organizations that play a role in supporting the community, both from a funding of science, but also a funding of science infrastructure. And there have been a variety of changes, both in the funding as well as the role that funders plays in the development of scholarly communications and scholarly research outputs. So what we want to do is have a roundtable conversation over the next 45 minutes, talking about a variety of topics related to the future of research funding and the role that funders play in the scholarly communications landscape. We'll then have some time for open conversation, so there'll be an opportunity for you all to ask some questions. We'll have maybe 10 or 15 minutes for Q&A. So let's start first by asking you each to describe the organization that you work at, your role within that organization, and how that organization plays in the scholarly communications landscape. So again, we'll start in alphabetical order. We'll deviate from that structure shortly, but we'll start with you, Stuart.
Yes, hey, I'm Stuart Buck, Vice President of Research at Arnold Ventures. For those who haven't heard of it, Arnold Ventures is a philanthropy. We're based in Houston. That's a home office, which is where I am, actually at home. And we have offices in New York and DC as well. Our biggest interest is in public policy areas like criminal justice reform. That's probably the biggest area of investment for us. We also have teams that work on health policy, issues like pharma pricing and low-value healthcare. We have a small team that works on opioids, so we fund a lot of research on opioid treatment programs and ways of improving kind of the opioid epidemic. We also work in K-12 education. So we have an interest in public policy, but throughout all of that, we have a strong theme of evidence-based policy, and research. So we fund a lot of social science and public policy research. Some economics research, a lot of criminology, some sociology, kind of analysis of the farmer markets, financial analysis, that type of work. But it's all kind of under the umbrella, I would say, social science. And as far as scholarly infrastructure goes, we've also, thanks to our interest in evidence and research, we've also for several years had a program of promoting reproducibility, rigorous research, issues like data sharing and pre-registration. We in that line of work, we founded a group called the Center for Open Science, for example, that works to try to improve the infrastructure for those types of issues. So that's kind of a meta interest of ours that kind of helps improve, I would say, the evidence and research base for the rest of the public policy issues that we're interested in.
Great. Lyric, off to you.
Thanks so much. So I am the Deputy Director for Science Policy at the National Institutes of Health. I have an assumption most of you are familiar with the National Institutes of Health, the world's largest funder of biomedical research. We fund roughly between $40 and $45 billion worth of research. So I'm going to talk specifically about the work in my office in particular, which really thinks about the overarching policy issues facing biomedical research, how to make sure that it can move swiftly and into practice effectively, while at the same time upholding the values that we really care about in biomedical research, making things are safe, effective, upholding public trust, and more. We have a pretty large office with a pretty large portfolio, but I think particularly relevant for today's conversation are issues about how we promote open science. And what I mean by open science is thinking about how to accelerate research by providing access to data and publications and information so that people can make the most of the taxpayers' investment in science, but also how we maintain public trust. So we know a lot about what research participants, how they want their information used. And so how do we make the most of all of the nation's investment in research and make it open and effective to really affect our research missions? So thank you for inviting me today.
Great, thank you. And Steve?
Hi, thanks, Todd. Good to see everybody. My name is Steve Pinchot. I'm the CEO at Ultim. We run a platform called Proposal Central. Proposal Central is the largest independent research and grants management system out there. We have over 120 global funders on the platform using the same piece of software to do their end-to-end grants management. So predominantly health and biomedical research funders, but we also work with environmental research, agricultural research, chemical research funders as well. So yes, working across a lot of different organizations, all trying to push the ball forward in these areas.
Great, fantastic. And Lloyd?
Yes, I'm Lloyd Whitman. I'm at the National Science Foundation. I think most people are familiar with us. Our budget last year was about $8 billion, and we support about 25% of all the federally supported basic research at American colleges and universities. And in many areas such as mathematics, computer science, and social sciences, we're really the dominant funder. In this space, I like to talk about, in terms of open science or publication policy and things like that, in terms of three different aspects of the things NSF does. The first being sort of understanding sort of the trends and problems and needs in a policy area like that, which we would do through working with in the interagency, working with the academies and funding those kinds of studies, funding workshops, and sort of essentially working within the community to identify what needs to be done and where the needs are. We support research, and that includes research infrastructure in this space. And that includes people, everything from understanding new ways of disseminating data or the impact of that to setting up repositories and other kinds of infrastructure. We support through the research in the peer review process. And then lastly, in terms of disseminating policy and best practices, which we do, for example, through our proposal guide and things like data management plans and the various ways that we essentially implement our processes and our policies in this space.
All right, great. So what we want to do now is dig into some specifics about how our landscape is and is changing. The first and most obvious question has to do with the pandemic and the situation that we're all facing, both with regard to the pandemic, but also the economic situation. And how has this affected your organization, your organization's goals? Are there things that you're changing vis-a-vis the pandemic, and is it changing your work or your funding? So I'm going to kick off with you, Lyric, since this is most directly to your work. So yeah.
Thank you very much. Of course, this is definitely affecting our work. The National Institutes of Health is at the forefront of trying to advance the research to really understand the progression of COVID-19 and SARS-CoV infection. I think one of the things that's really highlighted for us is the importance of access to information in a timely fashion and how to balance that with quality information. I mean, one of the things I hope to talk with this community today is about rigorous and reproducible science and how do you get that information out there quickly, and the value of peer review balanced with quick dissemination of information. One of the things that we have launched in response to the pandemic is a preprint pilot. The National Library of Medicine has been working to make sure we have access to research findings as soon as we can get them, marking them clearly that they have yet to be published, but that the information can be out there to accelerate discovery in this area. We do spend a lot of funding on working through this pandemic. Again, NIH's portfolio is relatively large, so it is always a balance of scientific opportunity and public health need, which is important. So the scientific opportunity has to be there, but we are definitely pivoting a lot of responses with new public-private partnerships, and all of the things that we are assembling to accelerate vaccines and treatments and behavioral strategies are all in an area in which information is shared globally to help everyone reach the goal of combating this pandemic in a timely fashion. So I would definitely say we are working hard on it and really taking note of what strategies we have implemented to see what is effective for implementing in the long term. In a non-pandemic state, it's hard to be tracking what we're doing in real time and doing the work, but we want to make sure we've taken away what has been really successful and integrated it into standard practice moving forward.
Great. And Stuart, from your perspective, has the pandemic impacted the Arnold Foundation in any way?
On a couple of levels, although we're not a biomedical or medical research funder very much at all, but we have sought some opportunities to make kind of targeted gifts outside the normal social science areas for us that focus on COVID-related research. Another way that it affected us, at least temporarily, was the stock market took a tumble, and that affected our endowment early in the year. But now it's risen back. I'm not sure quite why. I don't claim to understand why the stock market is so out of kilter with the entire rest of the economy and employment. But it's come back, and so that was more of a temporary phenomenon, I guess. And then, in several ways, I mean, the COVID epidemic has an impact on the rest of the public policy work that we do. So criminal justice is a great example. There are thousands and thousands of prisoners and people in jail across the country that have come down with COVID, thanks to overcrowding, just unsanitary conditions. So we've looked at some research and policy opportunities, to try to alleviate that problem. I mean, most recently, I just saw a story that 190 prisoners in Texas have died of COVID. So that's and these are people that had been sentenced to death, for example. So they're in prison for some reason that was not sentencing them to death, and yet here they are dying because of this epidemic. So it's a serious public policy problem to try to figure out how do you remedy that situation, and what should you do. So we've had people on our criminal justice team trying to think about those and other issues.
Great. And Lloyd?
So there's is a variety of ways, things that affected us. First, operationally, I'd say it's been, NSF has really done a phenomenal job for a variety of reasons. We were very well equipped to keep working. It's been actually remarkably seamless and a testament to a lot of staff with, people with family responsibilities, that our actual grant program, the administration of the essentially NSF system has gone on really, really well. So that's been relatively unaffected, which is great. We responded to COVID through what we call rapids, so a series of very quick proposal systems that could be turned around in weeks. I'm trying to remember the numbers. I think it's on the order of 1,000 of those, essentially very rapid funding responses in terms of research related to the pandemic. We've worked with OMB and other agencies to provide flexibility in grants management. We're very concerned about the STEM workforce to make sure that grad students and postdocs continue to be paid even if they can't work in the lab. So that's been going on. And then we've done some interesting things, starting to look forward to the impact of COVID on, for example, the STEM workforce, starting, for example, in our in computer science, a fellowship for people who basically missed out on faculty positions that should have been in faculty positions, but because of the situation, hiring isn't going on. So creating some fellowships for people to sort of bide them time to continue them acting in the field until things start recovering in that space. So there's been a whole suite from operations all the way to working on the STEM research and through the STEM workforce.
Mm-hmm. And Steve, you work with a variety, a wider variety of organizations. Has there been, from your perspective, have you been hearing things from the funders that you support about their impacts?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a lot of our customers are, they're raising money every year. So the idea of having a walk or a run or a charity gala is certainly they've had to rethink all their models of their fundraising. So they've been very impacted trying to figure out how to live in this new world. So some of them are putting their funding on hold, some of them are delaying it, some of them are scaling back, seeing that the more opportunities that do come out will be more competitive because there's fewer of them. And certainly at the end of the day, this boils down to like the ROI on the investment, right? So how are they going to see and show their donors that they're really getting the biggest impact for the money that they're investing? So we're having a lot more conversations around organizations saying, look, we really need to better tie our research to the outcomes and show those donors what they're getting for their investment.
Yeah. Now, I mean, one of the 800-pound, one of the elephants in the room is the economy and the economic situation, as well as the transfer of power in Washington due to the recent election. And I'm going to acknowledge the fact that there is this elephant over there, but none of us have a crystal ball. None of us are necessarily economic prognosticators. None of us can really say where the market is headed or where the next administration is headed. So I'm not going to put any of our speakers on the hook for any of that, apart from wave at it and say, we all know that it's out there. We collectively decided not to head in that direction, but there is a variety of things, a variety of important topics that we can discuss that I think all of us, all of the panelists have a great deal of expertise in, and I know the publishers who are listening in have an interest in hearing about. So the first of those topics has to do with openness as an important element of research. And Lyric and Lloyd both mentioned this, and Stuart as well. The movement towards transparency in scholarship. How can funders advance the goals of transparency and openness? And what has your organization done to support those goals? So, Lloyd, I'm going to start with you.
Sure. So I mean, first of all, the federal agencies all following the sort of publication guidance from the 2013 memo, from the 2013 actions from the White House in terms of making things publicly, our publications publicly available, NSF does that through its public access repository. So NSF performers all deposit their publications there, subject to the embargo requirements into that memo. We've also, again, participated and supported a lot of these sort of discovery activities I talked about. So like the National Academy study on reproducibility, replicability. And then, as I said, we fund a lot of research and systems in how to do open science, whether that's our collaboration with Amazon on fairness in AI. We have, what other, let's see, we have programs on making sure computer science people post their codes. We have one of our things called our big ideas and harnessing the data revolution, which is looking at a wide range of ways of making scientific data available at scale. And also, again, through things like our data management plans and our proposal system. So there's a whole suite of things, again, from understanding what's going on to supporting new ways of making things available to actually making sure people make them available through policy.
And Stuart, I know you've been involved in a lot of issues around openness in science. Can you talk a little bit about the work that Arnold has done?
Sure. So one aspect is just in the research that we fund, again, in social science and public policy areas, we for several years have had a policy that you should pre-register it publicly if it's a kind of an empirical project involving statistical inference. You should share data if at all possible. There are lots of legal restrictions that often make it difficult or impossible, but share data as much as you can. Share a computer code that's written to analyze data, and share the results publicly in some format. And we're kind of agnostic as to whether that's a preprint or working paper, or whether it's an open access publication, or just some sort of research report that sometimes grantees will send to us and we can just make available. We're kind of agnostic, as I say, as to the exact format, but we want the results to be out there for the basic reason that we want our research, the research that we fund, to be of the maximal public value, and we want to avoid publication bias. So this phenomenon across many fields where results that are kind of positive, exciting, are more likely to be published than null results or messy results or negative results. That's kind of a broad sweeping statement, but it's been shown in lots, and we want to avoid that. We want all the research to be out there, so that people can learn from the null, messy, and negative results. So that's as to the research we fund. We've also funded some external groups. I mentioned the Center for Open Science is one of the biggest grantees that we've had in this area. So they work on everything from kind of meta research projects. They did most famously a big reproducibility project in psychology that tried to reproduce 100 psychology experiments. It was published in Science in 2015. They work on software, like they have a software program called the Openness framework. They also work on public policy issues related to this. So they kind of do a lot related to open science. They host preprint servers as well. Should have mentioned that. But we funded other efforts to try to just improve transparency and openness. Some of it's in clinical trials in medicine. So we funded Ben Goldacre at Oxford. We funded a group at Yale, the Collaboration on Research Integrity and Transparency. We funded the Meta Research Innovation Center at Stanford. Just a number of kind of organizations and initiatives trying to promote transparency in clinical trials in particular, because that's such an important area that affects all of our health. So anyway, we as I say, we promote openness both through the research that we fund and kind of more broadly throughout the scholarly ecosystem.
Yeah. And Steve, have you seen this from your perspective in the wider philanthropic community as well?
Yeah, I mean, we're starting to see some of it. I mean, some of our funders, require data plans and things like that, but I'd say it's still early days for most of the funders we work with. So over the past few years, one of the things we've really worked on is to educate and sort of help bring along the organizations around things like Orchid and other persistent identifiers, and what is, ROAR, the organization registry. And we're one of 4 sponsoring organizations with Crossref. So we have funders now starting to talk about getting DOIs for grants and publishing the grant metadata as well. So I think it's really exciting times. I think that more and more of the funders will start to do this, and then things like that will help to bridge the gap between what's being funded and the linkage to the outputs that Crossref, the massive amount of data that Crossref already has about what's being published. So the funders will have a better link of like, okay, I funded this, and here are the outputs that are being tracked in Crossref. So yeah, so we're getting there. It's still early days, but a lot of exciting things happening.
Yeah. And Lyric, you had touched on transparency and openness in your introductory remarks. I'm going to dig into that a little bit more in terms of some of the things that NIH is doing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as I mentioned, NIH is supported by tax dollars, so it's taken this theory of transparency, or this value of transparency rather, really seriously. I mean, we have taken, similar to NSF, a soup to nuts approach with transparency, everything from a funded application through the research data, through the publication, all available, for instance, in our reporter, which is a one-stop shop for people to be able to look at all of the progress, products, and more from the research cycle. So I think that that's really important. We also are taking transparency as only one part of the commitment, but transparency and to the public, but usability of that information as well. And so I think one of the things that we are finally on the cusp of is the technology infrastructure to really make openness usable by the scientific community. And that's what we're really thinking about now in terms of FAIR principles or interoperable systems. I'm really wanting to have the conversation about repositories and great, you put your data in a repository, how do you find it, use it, and make sense of it? And so this is the system we're trying to create. We've done a lot of work, for instance, in cloud pilots and other things to share information. And I've taken it one step further in terms of, for instance, our All of Us program, in which all the research collected is in different tiered levels of controlled access to open access. So non-traditional communities, so not just our PIs, but the average person who's interested in applying their smarts to data sets can get in and try to make useful connections. And so those are kind of some of the transparency and usability of information is really what we're focused on.
Mm-hmm. And related to usability is the sort of administrative burden, if you will, both of getting and receiving funding, but also all of the things that, all of the requirements that are related to transparency and openness. Lloyd, when we talked earlier, you had mentioned there is this balance between the administrative burden of going through the grant funding process. And I believe you mentioned there's a interagency task force and exploring some of these questions. Do you want to talk a little bit about this balance of, getting both making science transparent and open, but also the process of getting and receiving grants and working through the grant funding process? Are there ways in which that could be made simpler and not as onerous?
Sure. In fact, we recently launched one of them, which is working directly with NIH for NSF people to use the Science CV system that they developed, and we've made some sort of a customized version such that people can submit their, generate a bio sketch from the same common platform, so we are constantly looking for ways to do things like that, making better use of PIDs like Orchids and things like that to pre-populate things. In terms of, in general, we want to reduce those kind of burdens on researchers, while simultaneously, if we're asking them to constantly update things, we have to strike that balance. We're also very cognizant of the fact, of two things within NSF. One is, we get 40 some odd thousand proposals a year. So from a wide variety of disciplines. So frequently, we're very cautious about changes, because even the smallest thing affects an awful lot of people, a lot of DPRs, a lot of PIs. So we're very, we might not move as fast as some people would like, but there's very good reasons for that. But we are moving along this way, and as Lyric and others, a number of us are have been very actively involved, and I expect will continue to be, regardless, of as we go through transition, at looking how to strike those balances and make it as easy as possible for people to be transparent, to apply for funding, and then to make the results of those funding publications and data as readily available as possible. We also at NSF also have to recognize that we have a wide variety of fields that we represent. This is somewhat different, for example, I think, than NIH. So it's a big difference between worrying about astrophysics data or genomics, data from biology research, or mathematics. So I had, a conversation once with, someone talking about data management plans, and someone, one of the program managers, program officers from mathematics said, well, in my program, we don't have any data, right? Because we're doing pure research in mathematics, right? So you can't mandate a data management plan for those. That doesn't make sense. So we do try to do what makes sense and work very closely within the different disciplines to do what makes sense within those disciplines.
And Lyric, I know you, Lloyd mentioned that you've been working together. Do you want to add anything?
Lloyd hit on all the major points. I think we recognize in the federal government that we are asking for people to do more when people are continually having more asked of them. I think one of the things we are really trying to strike a balance of is shifting the culture of conversation, that, just as publishing something, publishing your results, sharing your information is part of the research process. And so we're really trying to help and enable the community to do so. At NIH, for instance, we just released a new data management sharing policy in which we talk specifically about, we recognize doing this kind of stuff, curating data, submitting data, updating it, takes time and effort, and submit those costs in your application. We're willing to give you money to be able to do this and do this well. And so I think we are aware of what we're asking. We're asking some of the community to, again, recognize it's integral to the research process of sharing information, but also willing to help make it the infrastructure useful and seamless to allow them to do good science and not spend their time, entering forms and for the government.
Mm-hmm. And Steve, when you mentioned earlier your involvement in things like Orchid, do you want to touch a little bit more, since you're working with a variety of organizations, things that you're doing to help alleviate the burdens of grant funding?
Yeah, we're certainly, we've been a member of Orchid for years now, and about a year now with Crossref, helped donate to the ROAR organization. Yeah, the way we look at it is we have, one SaaS platform with 120 plus global funders. So we have this really unique opportunity to leverage the data in some really unique ways, so trying to get the funders to start to think about sharing data across their communities, right? So if we have 40 cancer funders on our platform, how can they leverage their programs, the actual grants, the applications that come in, so that they all can sort of see, like, who's funding what, where, let's not recreate the wheel here. So a little bit far off from that, but I think there's some really interesting opportunities with AI, machine learning, and where this is all going, and just having the data all in one place that will start to accelerate, and I think let them do more with less overall. So I think Crossref will be a big help in that. And then we're going to start down the road of working with DataCite as well. So the data citation piece is probably the next phase in that evolution.
Mm-hmm. And Stuart, your organization has been involved in supporting a variety of elements of the scholarly information infrastructure, if you will, preprint servers and a variety of other services and tools for our community. Do you think there are things that are missing, or things that could be improved, things that publishers and funders might be interested in working on, or things that the infrastructure of getting content and research outputs out into the community? Do you think there are things that could be improved?
Sure, and one thing that I think we discussed in our call earlier is just I do think funders in general, and this is with a broad brush, could prioritize infrastructure, and this is very broad, prioritize infrastructure to a greater extent they currently do. I think a lot of times, and this is true of us, it's true of most people, it's easy to jump to from one shiny new object to the next. But a lot of times just the boring, unsexy infrastructure component, whether it's a publishing, whether it's, I mean, if you look at our roads and bridges in our society, you know, that's, I think infrastructure often is kind of underfunded. You know, just the routine maintenance gets neglected because it's not as exciting, it's not as politically appealing, it's not as, you know, emotionally satisfying. Whatever the motivations of a funder are, it's easy to neglect infrastructure. And so I think just, yeah, thinking about infrastructure broadly, I think is important. As far as like specifics, one thing that I wish I could see as a funder or as someone who, you know, participates in funding research, I wish there was an easier way to kind of tie together all the activities that researchers have engaged in, and in particular, you know, whether they have engaged in the kind of what I would call good practices, best practices of research, you know, whether they've pre-registered studies that can be pre-registered, you know, whether they've shared data when they can, whether they've shared code, whether they publish openly, etc. I mean, it's hard. I'll admit it's hard even for us when we directly fund a researcher. It's hard to kind of go back and figure out, did they do all those things that they're supposed to? It's kind of tedious, and you know, sometimes you're chasing down publications that appear years after the grant is over, and you're trying to figure out what, you know, did we even fund the work that led to this publication, you know, or not? So it's hard to figure that out even when you're directly involved in the research, much let alone to, you know, look at new research applicants, new proposals, and try to figure out what's the I guess pattern of behavior that this researcher has engaged in. It's easy enough to go to, you know, Google Scholar or to some other resource and get a long list of publications and citations. You know, that's good, but I'd like to be able to know more, to you know, to see if that researcher has engaged in the kind of open practices that we believe in.
And Lyric, NIH has done a tremendous amount in supporting scholarly infrastructure. Do you also think, you know, there are other things that we should be spending time or investing in?
Man, I'm not sure I could second Stuart's comments enough in terms of the need for good infrastructure. You know, we struggle with providing infrastructure that is suitable for the now, let alone for what's going to happen in 20 years from now and how quickly things evolve. And so to be able to really have good infrastructure systems for people to make things accessible and usable, I think is just really, really an important and critical aspect for investment.
Mm-hmm. And Lloyd, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, so one of the interesting things about NSF, and I've been here about 18 months or so, is the way that it operates in sort of a very interesting feedback loop with the academic research community across disciplines. So as things emerge from those areas as being really important, for example, in infrastructure, then that ends up being reflected in our solicitations and what we focus on. So for example, we have in our biological sciences directorate, you know, a sustaining infrastructure for biological research program. Specifically, that's the title of it, and it's active, and it is funding things like the creation of data infrastructure, right? Because that came out of the community as being something that's really important. So then we put out solicitations and then fund the best proposals to accomplish those goals. So that's one aspect of it. The other it has to do, I think, with PIDs, which is a much more longer-term vision, because there's so much infrastructure that needs to develop around that. But I think certainly there's a large number of people inside and outside the government that see a vision where when we have PIDs associated with both the inputs and the outputs of research and development, it'll make it much easier to do that. So when every grant, person, and publication, patent, data set have PIDs that are coupled, then though there's again a tremendous amount to do to get to that point, I think that's a vision for how we can much better assess all of those kinds of all the linkages and see what how those things have happened.
Yeah. That's great, Lloyd. I literally just got off a phone call with ESOC and the Freya project talking about persistent identifiers and knitting all of that community together.
It's easy to have a vision. It's not so easy to make it all happen with the number of parts involved in that to develop that ecosystem for that to happen.
Yeah, true. Speaking of ecosystems and the pandemic, quick question, Lyric, in the planning for this, this is related to infrastructure. You talked about getting the science out quickly. I mean, this is critically important now with the pandemic, and there's been a desire, broadly speaking, about accelerating the distribution of results. Part of that has been a shift towards preprints and the ecosystem around preprints. Could you talk a little bit about the NIH's motivations there and your feelings about the implications of that, both positive and negative, for the scholarly communications landscape?
Sure. I mean, the access to information in the most rapid fashion is it's a real priority for NIH. Just last week, I think the NIH director released a statement asking researchers to consider submitting results to clinicaltrials.gov in advance of actual legal requirements, just to help the community get access to information more quickly. So we've seen that everything from data all the way through results and especially through preprints and other kind of analyses. I think one of the things we are really trying to focus on is make sure that when we put out preprints and things with our data sharing policy is that the underlying data and algorithms and code are made accessible so that they can be replicated and tested. So either it can be validated or the holes in the research could be pointed out and raised early before people have spent too much time in that effort. So the real goal is to have as much information out there as possible to let the scientific community course correct itself. Again, that's the broad vision, and I think that the more data points you get, the more accurate conclusions you can draw. It is not without risk without a broad set of data points, right, to actually have that course correction. And so when you ask about the vision, I think it's pretty apparent of where we're trying to go. Of course, the concerns always remain of putting information out there that is not validated and people taking and running with it, especially when it comes to things like clinical trials or other things where patients are at the forefront of potentially erroneous results. So I think those are the things we are trying to counterbalance, is making sure information is broadly accessible and also, though, used in ways that are with the appropriate caveats and appropriate warnings, and people understand what that means. We run into this problem with clinicaltrials.gov a lot because it's on a government server and people think, hey, a trial on a government server, this must be vetted. That's not quite the information on there. It's about accessibility. So how do we give people the information they need to make good decisions is ultimately at the crux of it. And so with the preprint thing, I think the pilot has been moving since June. We are going to look through what are those implications. How many of those studies never get published? Why don't they get published? Is it because they were erroneous? Did it lead to new research directions? So I think we will be able to really learn from this effort and shape kind of our future policy directions.
Okay. One last question before we open it up for some audience questions. And this is kind of a futuristic. If you could maybe wave a magic wand and change the either the publisher or scholarly communications environment to support the work of researchers, what do you think that might be? Steve, I'm going to start with you. Are there ways that we can work more collaboratively together to help the work of the researchers?
Yeah, I mean, the one thing that comes to mind that we're really passionate about and trying to figure out is how do we better build a bridge between funders and the scholarly publishing side and the publishers. So if there's, for example, if there's peer review happening on both sides and our funders are peer reviewing, you're getting scientists together, you're reviewing these grant applications, you're deciding it's good science, you're scoring them and ranking them. If there was a way along the course of your 3 or 5 year grant and project to have some way to sort of validate and verify that on the funder side or someone else, so then when that project is over, and the output is some sort of preprint or manuscript or something, that there's some connection between the publisher side and the funder side to just streamline the process. You know, publishers still may want to verify to some degree, but to sort of leverage the work that the funders do is a really interesting area that we're going to look into.
And Stuart, same question.
Sure. I mean, if I could wave a magic wand, this maybe has less to do with infrastructure per se, but if I could change one thing about the way publishers interact with researchers, I wish publishers could figure out how to work to make more kinds of work products by researchers capable of being noticed and given credit by the academic community. So that might be peer review, that might be writing a comment that leads to a correction or retraction. Yeah, that might be creating data that gets cited, data citations. I just think that researchers and the research community have often been too limited in, just viewing a static article PDF as the one thing that gets you credit within academia, whereas software, code, data, peer review, I mean, all these sorts of things are a tremendously important part and often go kind of unnoticed or uncredited. And so I feel like if publishers could work together with academia to surface more of that activity and give it the appropriate credit, that would be great.
And Lloyd?
Yeah, I think I'd second that. That probably, I mean, besides the practical of lots of communication between the parties as to what the needs are, I think there really does need to be this sort of longer term culture shift about, as Stuart just said, is recognizing all the different sort of outputs and products associated with research and the way they can be shared, and incentivizing that by giving recognition and credit for doing that, right? So I can tell a personal story because my son's a graduate student and was doing something with code, and I'm like, so are you going to make that code available? And he said, well, oh God, that would be a lot of work to clean it up in a way that I could make it available. So, and I don't think anybody would use it. But basically, the answer was he had zero incentives to do that. There was no incentive at all, positive incentive. He just viewed it as work. It wasn't clear that he said, oh, if somebody wanted it, they could email me, right? So we really need to sort of build this culture and system where all of those kinds of things are routinely done and easy to do.
Yeah. And Lyric, I'll give you the last word before we open it up for audience questions.
Well, first, I would say never give me a magic wand because I could go on for hours. I would certainly echo my colleagues' comments because I think they were spot on. But since I have multiple things, I'll add one in anyway. I would love to see the publishers play a stronger role in helping with the standards issue. I think one of the things with the rigor and reproducibility crisis in biomedical research has really been plaguing us, and as an agency, we've been working on it really hard. One of the solutions to some of that problem is standards and consistent ways of people replicating information. We as an agency can obviously make policies around standards, but while we don't have the diversity problem that Lloyd has, biomedical research still is pretty diverse, and the standards of MRI data versus genomics versus behavioral research all vary. And so the scholarly communication, or the scholarly community and publications of what kind of information is really necessary in a publication or supplemental information to really have a rigorous, robust study design replicated in the various fields, I think is immensely important and a real role that the community can help us with, because when it comes to standards, we certainly sometimes need to implement them as the federal government, but the community working with the data tend to know those things the best. And if it can be a ground up driven process, I think it's a much more effective one.
Thank you, Lyric. And to be clear, I did not solicit that answer. Fantastic. We have a number of questions from our audience. So we'll start with you, Stuart. You had mentioned early on the impact of the pandemic, the financial impact on the pandemic impacting your budgets when the stock market tumbled at the beginning of the year, but then it's since recovered. What's the general view, and this applies to all of you, what's the general view about funders' award budgets? And is that going to improve, stabilize, be the same in 2021, 2022? Any thoughts?
I don't have a crystal ball here, but I mean, I think for us, it's returned to kind of normal for whatever that means. It's kind of stabilized back what it would have been, but who knows what the future holds, right?
Yeah. Lyric, Lloyd, any ideas, thoughts with regard to the federal government?
I'll make a comment that, so the federal budget is determined by Congress. You can actually go and look at what the appropriations bills that have been in both the House and the Senate for the current fiscal year that we're already in, which I think generally have much smaller increases than in the last couple of years, which were significant. But beyond the current fiscal year, there's an awful lot of moving parts that we're all waiting to see where they land.
And I think Steve raised this earlier, the ROI problem is interesting. Obviously, you want to make sure your investment in research is being maximized, and we all get that, as I assume most of us are tax-paying citizens who want our research dollars used well. But it's really hard and getting increasingly more difficult in terms of drawing the tangible outcomes of basic science. We know basic science is the engine for all of our discoveries as well as NSF. And so having that kind of the public health outputs and the value of basic science and having those adequately funded, I think will continue to remain a real perennial problem.
And Steve, any thoughts on the what you're hearing from your community?
Yeah, I mean, I think it'll be interesting to see, right, how their year looks and how the fundraising numbers end up. We had one customer say, and I think it was in July, that at that point in the year, they used to generate $1 million a day in donations, and they were generating 100,000 a day. So, I think, some of these customers are getting rid of their office space and having people go home. And so I think there are some delays. We are seeing, the fall is very busy for us right now. So there's a lot of programs being launched, a lot of funding opportunities, but unclear into next year. I would say it will be sort of steady, might be down slightly from previous years, but I would think it would start to come back into next year. But yeah, really to say.
Yeah, again, none of us are economists, and none of us are prophets. A question for Lyric and Lloyd about transparency and openness. Wondering, you make available the abstracts of funded grant proposals. Is there a reason why you don't make the full grant proposals available?
I'm not sure I know the history of that, but I think in general, I think it's that these are people, essentially they're people, some set proprietary kind of thinking about what they plan to do, which I think NSF does not view as our role to share. But I will say that's not an issue that I've been involved in at NSF, so I can't comment much beyond that.
I mean, we make abstracts available, and we make research aims available, and some other components. So it's more than just the abstract, but not the entirety of the proposal. We are thinking about how to make our data management and sharing plans publicly available. We've talked about that in the policy as well, so people can actually see how the data will be shared, where it will be shared, and hold the investigators' feet to the fire a bit. So keeping those kind of options open are on the table for us. I do agree with Lloyd. Some of the information is proprietary, and wanting to make sure we balance those issues, which the legal and other kind of confidential information, with the need to share and be transparent.
And let me say, I'm not talking about that proprietary in a business sense, but more in an intellectual sense.
Yeah. Understood. there's a question here about the role of funders in post-publication promotion of the funded research. So once is there a role for funders in this process of the distribution of ideas doesn't end with the publication of a paper? Do you see a role there for funding organizations? Maybe Stuart?
I mean, I can just speak for ourselves. Like we many times when research comes out, we have some sort of press release or article on our website describing research and its results. We try to do that broadly. So, for example, we have a small team called the Evidence-Based Policy Team that funds RCTs of social programs, and they write up and put on our website the results of any RCT that is funded by us, whether or not it was positive or negative or null. So trying to be fair and balanced in that regard. But that's just what we do.
I can comment on NSF. We do try to make it easy to find information. It's, like I said, though we don't make the full proposals, it's very, very simple to go to the NSF website and search for awards, and for each award, identify all of the publications associated with that award. And then again, within the policies we have, go to the public access repository and find it. And at least our public affairs office is very much focused on demonstrating to the public the value of their investment in NSF research. So we, there's a barrage of outputs of research outputs designed generally actually for the general public to appreciate the discovery that's supported by NSF.
And any last thoughts before we wrap up? Any topics that that you wanted to get in? Any last thoughts you'd like to send to the publishing community before we wrap up? We only have a couple minutes.
I mean, I think I might add that the publishing community is part of the research ecosystem. I think we mentioned earlier that dissemination of information is not only for transparency, but also usability to advance discovery. And so it is a partnership with the funders and the researchers, as I think Steve also mentioned, and figuring out how to make that work for all parties is really important. So continuing the dialogue and figuring out how to move into the future together, where we can all get as many wins out of it as possible to accelerate our work, I think is really important to look forward to.
Yeah. All right, so with that, I'm going to pass it back to our organizers and draw the session to a close. Before I do, I would really like to thank Lyric, Stuart, Steve, and Lloyd for joining us today. This has been hopefully an informative session for all of the participants. I really appreciate having the conversations with you all. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you for the organization, the work that your organizations do to help drive science forward. So thank you all, and over to you.
I've got it here, Todd. So I wanted to second my thank you to Lyric and Steve, Lloyd, Stuart, and to you as well for engaging in a really fantastic discussion today. Thank you also to the audience for attending, and to ARFA, who is our sponsor for today's session. Once again, please do take the time to respond to our webinar evaluation that you'll receive via email. Your feedback helps us to continually improve this program. Keep an eye out for the schedule of webinars starting in 2021. And now we also have a few events that are coming up for the SSP for the remainder of the year. So please sign up for some of these and attend as well. Thank you all for your participation. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks.
Thanks. Bye-bye.